August the 25th, 2010. A Wednesday. Late summer, warm enough that most of the windows in Los Angeles would still have been open. The kind of evening where you can hear the neighbours talking through the screen door, and the whole city just hums with the low, ordinary noise of people going about their lives. Somewhere in that city, a young man named Nick Clark walked into a derelict building looking for his girlfriend. And what he found there, or rather, what she had become, is more or less the moment everything ended. Not just for him, not just for his family, not just for the city of Los Angeles, for everyone. We know it as the wildfire virus. The show uses multiple names for the virus, but wildfire is rarely mentioned on screen. A pathogen that infected its hosts and then did something that, in the grand scheme of biological disasters, is genuinely unprecedented. It brought them back, not alive, not in any meaningful sense, but moving, hungry, and completely impossible to reason with. Nick found his girlfriend Gloria on the 25th of August. 2 days later, on the 27th, something happened that the Walking Dead universe would name Monument Day, the 48-hour window between discovery and total systemic collapse, hospitals overrun, governments issuing alerts too late and too vague to actually help anybody, cities trying to lock down streets that had already become impassable, and in very short order, chaos, real, irreversible, civilization-ending chaos. And what I want to do in this video is not talk about the virus itself, we've covered that in other videos, but the places, the cities, the dozens of different ways that different locations, with their different geography and their different governments and their different populations and their wildly different amounts of luck, handled the end of the world. Because here is something about the Walking Dead universe that I think is genuinely interesting once you start looking at it properly. The apocalypse did not hit every city the same way, not even close. Some cities were bombed by their own governments, deliberately as policy. Some were taken over by military factions. Some fell slowly, over the course of years, communities holding on long after anyone expected them to. Some had survivors figure out the most creative, unexpected solutions imaginable. And a surprising number still have people in them, 15 years on, just quietly getting on with the business of being alive. We are going to go through all of them. Every city that gets meaningful screen time across the main series, Fear the Walking Dead, Dead City, The Ones Who Live, and Daryl Dixon. We are going to talk about how they fell, what they looked like in the immediate aftermath, and in some cases, the cases where the story has followed characters, their years into the apocalypse, what they look like now. It is a lot of ground to cover. We are going from Los Angeles to Tokyo, from Tijuana to London, from a small Georgian town nobody outside Georgia had ever thought much about, to the ruins of what used to be the United States government. So if you want to just settle in and let this wash over you for a while, that is exactly what it is here for. Before we get into it, if you're watching this and you have not subscribed yet, it would genuinely mean a lot if you just took a moment to do that. It is completely free, and it really does help the channel more than you might think. Anyway, that is enough of that. We are going to start somewhere small, not King County, where the main series begins, not Los Angeles, where Fear the Walking Dead opens. We are starting in a quiet little town in Georgia called King County, because King County is where we first actually properly understand, what the end of the world looks like from street level, and that is worth a bit of time. Rick Grimes wakes up in a hospital room and the first things he notices are the flowers. They have wilted. The water in the vase has gone stagnant. The clock on the wall has stopped. And it takes him a moment, and then several more moments, confused and dehydrated and barely functional, to understand what those three details are telling him. He's been unconscious for weeks. Not days, weeks. The world kept moving while he was lying there in that bed, and it moved so fast and so catastrophically that by the time he pulled himself upright and stumbled into the hallway, there was nothing left of the world that he recognized. King County is a county in Georgia. It is the kind of place where the deputy sheriff knows everybody, where the diner has the same menu it has had since 1987, where the roads get quiet after 9 in the evening. It is not the kind of place you would expect to see the apocalypse begin. And in a sense, it did not begin there. The virus started in France, Monument Day hit every major city at once. The collapse happened everywhere, simultaneously. But King County is where we first see what the collapse looks like, from the inside of a small town. And that particular view is useful, because small towns did not get safe zones. They did not get National Guard deployments or FEMA evacuation centres or government-issued instructions. The resources all went to the major cities, Atlanta, LA, DC, and the Kingstons and the King Counties of America just kind of got left to figure it out on their own. What that looks like, when we see it through Rick's eyes, is eerie quiet. A hospital long since abandoned, hallways with bullet holes in the walls, and messages written in paint. Roads choked with cars that went nowhere, houses with their doors hanging open. The town did not get bombed, it did not get organised, it just stopped. Morgan Jones is the person who finds Rick when he stumbles back to his house. And Morgan's situation tells you everything you need to know about what King County's collapse actually looked like on a human scale. He is not hiding in a community. He is not part of any organised group. He is in his neighbour's house, Fred and Cindy Drake's house, he specifies, which is a detail I always find oddly moving, with his son Dwayne nailing the doors shut and covering the windows before dark. Just one man and his boy, in a town full of the dead, doing what they can. Morgan's wife Jenny got infected early on. And Morgan, and this is the detail that the show keeps returning to, because it is so genuinely human, cannot bring himself to kill her. Even after she has turned, even knowing what she is now. He watches her walk the street outside the Drake house from the attic window, and he picks up the rifle and he puts it down again. Every time. That inability to act is not weakness, it is grief. And King County, in its own quiet way, is full of it. The King County Sheriff's Department is still there when Rick visits it, the building intact, the armory accessible. A functioning propane heating system means a hot shower, which strikes me as one of the most unexpectedly poignant details in the whole first season. A working shower in a dead town. Rick takes the guns, changes back into his uniform, and leaves. Morgan says he will follow in a few days. He does not follow. There is something about King County's story that I find genuinely affecting, which is that it gets no resolution for a very long time. The town is just left, sitting there in the background of the Walking Dead universe, with Morgan and Dwayne in someone else's house, and Jenny walking the street outside, and the clock stopped in Rick's hospital room. It is not bombed. It is not dramatically overrun. It just becomes a ghost town, which is somehow worse than the more spectacular fates some of the bigger cities get. Morgan does eventually leave, many seasons later. He makes it to Alexandria, then to the Fear the Walking Dead timeline, becoming one of the franchise's more travelled characters. But by then, King County has been empty for years. Whatever was left there, the memories in those houses, the belongings people could not carry, the whole accumulated weight of a normal town, is just sitting there in the Georgia heat. It is worth remembering that while Atlanta was getting National Guard tanks and CDC scientists and government priority status, the King Counties of America were getting nothing. And they fell just as completely. They just fell more quietly. Atlanta had a helicopter. I mean that literally. Rick sees a helicopter pass over the city when he arrives on horseback, and he chases it, because a functioning helicopter means organised survival, means government, means someone is still in charge of something. And he is right that it means all of those things. Atlanta was the most important city in America in the early days of the outbreak, and not just because of its size. Atlanta was home to the Center for Disease Control, and as long as scientists were working in that building, there was a chance, however slim, that someone might find a way to stop what was happening. So Atlanta got the full treatment, while King County got nothing and Los Angeles got safe zones that eventually collapsed. Atlanta got safe zones and tanks and helicopter patrols, and the kind of frantic, maximum effort government response that only comes when very powerful people have decided that a city is worth fighting for. The National Guard poured resources into the city on a scale that dwarfed anywhere else in America. There were tanks on the streets, there were helicopters circling, there were multiple safe zones set up across the city, and FEMA evacuation points outside of those. And the understanding, not the hope, the genuine institutional understanding that Atlanta might be the place where the outbreak got stopped. By Monument Day, the 27th of August, the military had issued the order that would be repeated in city after city across America. Anything outside the safe zones was to be killed, living or dead. That order sounds monstrous, and in individual human terms it was. But the logic behind it is not hard to follow. The walkers outside the perimeters were a threat, and distinguishing between an infected person and an uninfected person stumbling around in the chaos was not something soldiers could reliably do. So they stopped trying to distinguish. The safe zones held for a while. The CDC kept operating. Scientists stayed in that building long past the point where staying was a reasonable decision, working on cultures and samples and experiments that produced, in the end, nothing useful. Dr. Jenner, the last scientist still working in the building when Rick's group arrives much later, stayed because he had made a promise to his wife. His wife had been one of the test subjects. The work was all he had left. What ended Atlanta was not a single dramatic failure. It was the same thing that ended everywhere else. The sheer, relentless arithmetic of too many walkers and not enough soldiers, playing out over weeks and months until the math stopped working in the military's favour. The safe zones fell one by one. The FEMA camps outside the city became overwhelmed. And eventually, the National Guard made the decision to pull out. On September the 28th, nearly 2 weeks before Los Angeles would get its own version of this, the first Operation Cobalt bombing run hit Atlanta. Napalm on the streets of a major American city, Marines sent in afterward to shoot anything that moved, which is a detail that never quite sits comfortably, no matter how many times you read it. The government did not just abandon Atlanta, it destroyed it on the theory that a destroyed Atlanta was less dangerous than a fallen one. And here is the thing, the part that I think gets underappreciated about Atlanta: survivors remained anyway. The Vatos gang, a group of mostly older men protecting a nursing home full of residents, was still operating in the city when Rick's group arrived in Season 1. They had supplies, they had a system, they were doing something organised and deliberate in the ruins of a bombed city. Grady Memorial Hospital was still running in Season 5, a police department and a handful of medical staff maintaining a functioning, if deeply coercive community inside a hospital building. Years into the apocalypse, in a city that had been napalmed. Greg Nicotero, one of the show's longtime producers, did eventually confirm that both of those communities died off-screen. We never see it happen, but they lasted. They lasted for years after the bombing, which says something about human stubbornness that I genuinely appreciate, even when that stubbornness is not always being used for particularly noble purposes. Atlanta got more attention, more resources, and more destruction than almost any other city in the franchise. And people survived in the rubble anyway, for longer than anyone probably planned for. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The thing that makes Los Angeles interesting in the context of this whole story is timing, because Nick Clark's discovery on the 25th of August, stumbling across Gloria reanimated in that drug den, is the earliest confirmed Walker sighting in the Walking Dead universe, which means LA is not just one of the cities that fell. It is, in a very specific sense, the city where the falling started, the ground zero of everything. And yet for 2 entire days after that, the city had no idea. Reports came in, strange incidents, attacks that the police could not quite categorize. The hospitals started filling up. People who had been bitten were brought in, and then, well, you can imagine what happened in those hospitals over those 48 hours, once the bitten started dying and then started moving again inside the wards. By August 27th, Monument Day, Los Angeles was gridlocked. The kind of gridlock that happens when several million people all try to leave a city at exactly the same time, and most of them are stuck on the same 6 freeways. Riots had broken out across multiple neighborhoods. The police had already lost effective control before the military arrived. The National Guard was deployed and established 12 safe zones across the city. 12 in a city of over 3.7 million people. The mathematics of that are not encouraging, but you can see the logic. Pick strategic locations, create defensible perimeters, concentrate the survivors you can protect, and write off the rest. It is a brutal calculation. It is also probably the only one that made any sense in that situation. Pop-up hospitals were set up across the safe zones. The perimeters held for a while. And then, as in Atlanta, the arithmetic started losing. Walkers pressing against fences, supplies running thin, soldiers getting infected or killed or simply running out of the will to keep doing an impossible job. By September 8th, roughly 2 weeks after Monument Day, the Guard had made the decision to pull out. They did not just leave. They left, and then they came back, but not to help. Operation Cobalt in Los Angeles was scheduled for September the 9th, and it was kept to schedule. The Clark family, Nick, his mother Madison, his sister Alicia, his teacher Travis Manawa, got out on a boat, a yacht, technically, several miles offshore, and they watched from the water as the jets came in. The city burned on the horizon. That is how Fear the Walking Dead's first arc ends, a family on a boat watching Los Angeles die. It is one of the quieter, more understated apocalypse images in the franchise, and I think it is more effective for that. No dramatic music swell, just fire on the skyline and the ocean between the family and everything they used to know. Los Angeles is never revisited on screen. That is its final appearance in the story, as a distant column of smoke, a city of 3.7 million people, and we do not get to know what happened to anyone who did not make it onto a boat. The safe zones, the people who were inside them when the Guard pulled out, the hospitals, all of it just becomes part of the smoke. I find that restraint interesting, actually. The show could have gone back. It never did. And there is something in that absence that feels more honest than a dramatic revisit would have. Some things just end. Some cities just burn. And you do not get a scene where the camera sweeps over the ruins and gives you a sense of closure. There is one more detail I keep coming back to before we move on. The 48-hour window between Nick finding Gloria and Monument Day hitting is the window in which, in theory, the outbreak could have been caught, contained, ended before it became this. It was not. And nobody in that window, not the hospitals, not the police, not the government, understood quickly enough what was happening. The virus did not need to be clever. It just needed 2 days. Tijuana sits directly on the US border, which means that in the first days of the outbreak, the people living there had a front row view of what was happening just across the fence, the gridlock on the San Diego side of the border, the smoke, the sound of things going badly wrong in a very large city very close to where you live. Nick Clark ends up there, alone, several weeks into the apocalypse, and what he finds is something that does not quite match the American cities we have already been through. Tijuana was not bombed. It was not subjected to anything resembling Operation Cobalt. The Mexican government apparently made some attempts to contain the situation early on, and then, from what we can piece together, essentially abandoned the city to its own devices. Which is not great, but the not being bombed part matters more than you might initially think, because Tijuana, without napalm having been dropped on large sections of it, still has usable buildings, passable streets, infrastructure that mostly works. The city is not safe, the dead are absolutely present and in numbers, but it is not a scorched ruin. And that distinction creates space for something that Atlanta and Los Angeles never really got: the chance for survivors to organize at a human pace rather than a crisis pace. La Colonia is the community that forms in the hillside above Tijuana. Nearly 100 people, a real settlement with rules and relationships and a functioning dynamic. It is not large by any normal measure, but in the context of what we see in the early weeks of the apocalypse, 100 people who have found each other and built something is quietly remarkable. The Mexican cartel's presence in the city is one of the more interesting wrinkles in Tijuana's story. In the pre-apocalypse world, the cartel was a source of violence and instability. Post-apocalypse, they are running something that looks, from a certain angle, almost like commerce. Outposts, supermarkets where survivors can exchange goods for supplies. It is not a pleasant system. The cartel's methods did not become kinder just because the world ended, and I want to be clear that I am not romanticizing it, but it is a system, and in the early weeks, systems matter more than how they got there. The water problem is where Tijuana's story gets genuinely complicated. The Gonzales Dam, located just outside the city, controlled the flow of the Tijuana River, and a man named Dante, who controlled the dam, used that control the way powerful people have always used control of essential resources, as leverage. He let the river run dry. People in Tijuana needed to come to him, trade with him, submit to him, in exchange for the thing that every living creature needs to survive. It is a nasty, effective strategy, and it worked for a while. Nick blowing up the dam on October the 27th, day 64 of the outbreak, ends that particular arrangement, and the image immediately after the explosion is one of the more hopeful in Fear the Walking Dead's early seasons. Survivors at the riverbanks, collecting water. People who are still there, still alive, 2 months in. The city is rough. The situation is fragile, but it is not over. After season 3, Tijuana essentially disappears from the story. The show moves to a different part of Mexico and then to Texas, and the narrative never circles back. Whether La Colonia survived, whether the power vacuum left by the cartel's defeat was filled by something better or something worse, whether the city continued to hold, we genuinely do not know. That uncertainty is, in a strange way, appropriate for a place that was always surviving rather than thriving. Tijuana's story in the Walking Dead universe is about makeshift endurance, getting through the next day and the day after that, and figuring out the week after that when it comes. It is a less dramatic version of survival than the big city narratives, and maybe because of that, it feels a bit more real. From many places in Alexandria, Virginia, you can see Washington, D.C. on the horizon. The skyline is still there, more or less. The buildings did not all collapse. The monuments did not all fall. The city looks from a distance like it is still there. And in a physical sense, parts of it are. But Washington, D.C., as a place where people live and govern and make decisions about the world, that ended. The political significance of D.C. made it a priority alongside Atlanta in the government's initial response. Atlanta was prioritized because of the CDC. DC was prioritized because of what DC is, the seat of American government, the White House, Congress, the entire apparatus of federal power. Losing Washington, D.C. was not just a logistical problem, it was a symbolic catastrophe. As long as D.C. was holding, the government could tell itself, and more importantly, could tell the public that something was still functioning. Congress members and high-level officials were evacuated from the city early on. This is interesting information. It means the government was aware quite early that DC was not going to hold, and was making arrangements for its senior personnel before the general public had that information. The president, who within the Walking Dead universe is generally understood to be Barack Obama at the time of the outbreak, retreated with the vice president to a military-grade bunker beneath the White House. Whether they survived there, and for how long, and what happened to them after the bunker's resources ran out, the show does not tell us. Operation Cobalt hit DC as well. The same policy that burned Atlanta and Los Angeles was applied to the capital. High-level officials evacuated first, the button was pressed, and the city was bombed. The government destroyed its own seat of power, which is the kind of decision that only makes sense if you have already accepted that the game is over and you're just trying to manage the aftermath. In Season 4 of the main series, Eugene Porter tells Abraham's group that scientists in a government facility in Washington, D.C. are working on a cure. This is a lie. It is one of the show's best lies, actually, not because it is clever, but because it is built entirely on the city's reputation. DC is the place where solutions to national problems are supposed to come from. Eugene uses that reputation, that instinctive trust in the idea that the government might be fixing things somewhere in an official building, to keep himself alive and useful. When the group does finally reach the DC area, the city itself is empty. The museum that Rick's group visits in Season 9, scavenging for resources, loading a wagon with tools and seeds and things that might be useful in a world that has gone back to something close to the 18th century, has no survivors in it, no communities, just useful objects in an enormous building and the bones of something that used to matter very much. The metro tunnels in Season 11 are where Maggie's group ventures, going underground rather than street level, which is itself a statement about how viable the surface of DC actually is. More than a decade into the apocalypse, they go underground and they do not go up. Alexandria sits just outside the city. 15 years on, Alexandria is a functioning walled community. People living there, children being born there, decisions being made about the future. And from Alexandria, you can still see DC's skyline. The ruins of what was supposed to be the most powerful city in the world, visible from a neighborhood where people are growing vegetables and teaching each other skills, and trying to build something that lasts. I do not think the show intends that image as anything particularly heavy-handed, but it is there. Every day the people in Alexandria look toward the horizon and see what is left of the thing that was supposed to take care of them. Maggie Rao arrives on the Jersey shore and looks at Manhattan through a monocular, and her face when she sees it tells you everything before the show has said a single word about what happened there. The buildings are still standing, most of them anyway, but the streets below are moving, not with people, with what used to be people. A herd so vast it looks, from a distance, like a slow dark river running between the skyscrapers. Manhattan had approximately 1.5 million residents at the time of the outbreak. Greater New York City had over 8 million. Those numbers are staggering in any context, but in the context of a zombie outbreak, they translate into something that the show calls a megahorde, and that in practical terms means over 1 million walkers concentrated on a single island. An island from which, following Operation Cobalt, every bridge and tunnel had been destroyed. The military destroyed the connections between Manhattan and the mainland deliberately. The logic was containment. If you can keep the island's massive walker population from crossing to New Jersey, Queens, Brooklyn, you have at least bounded the problem. The logic works in a narrow sense. The million walker problem stays on the island. What the logic does not account for is the living people, also on the island, who now have no way out. There is a specific horror to Manhattan that does not apply to most other cities in the franchise, and it is this: the buildings. Manhattan is a city of skyscrapers, hundreds and hundreds of buildings, 40, 60, 80 stories tall, and in the early days of the outbreak, people fled upward, into the high floors, away from the streets, because the streets were impassable, which means that walkers also ended up on the upper floors. And walkers, unlike living people, do not stay where they land. They move towards sound. So any noise on the street below, a car backfiring, someone shouting, a door slamming, causes the walkers in the surrounding skyscrapers to move toward the source of the sound, through windows, if that is what is between them and the sound, which means they fall. Walkers raining from the sky is a detail from Dead City that sounds almost darkly comedic until you picture it happening around you, and then it becomes something else entirely. I genuinely think it is one of the most creative pieces of environmental horror in the whole franchise, a city's greatest architectural achievement turned into its most lethal characteristic. The subway tunnels were used as mass grave sites by the military during the early response, bodies stacked underground, out of sight and out of the way. The problem with that decision, which presumably seemed practical at the time, is that decomposing bodies in an enclosed space produced toxic gases. The tunnels became unbreathable, and in some cases, and this is the detail that really escalates the Manhattan situation into its own category, walkers in those tunnels fused. Partial decomposition, confined spaces, bodies pressing together in the dark until they became something that is technically multiple individual walkers, but functions as something larger and considerably harder to deal with. And yet, people survived in Manhattan, not despite the skyscrapers, because of them. The streets became essentially impassable for anything that could not handle falling walkers and megahorde navigation, but the tops of buildings, those became living space, rooftops as residential areas, and navigation between rooftops via zip lines, actual zip lines strung between skyscrapers, which creates this image of a city where you live 60 stories up, and you cross from building to building through open air, with the horde moving in the canyon below you. Factions formed. The Barazi is the one we see most of in Dead City, but they are clearly not the only group. Competing survivor organizations staking out different sections of the city, different buildings, different resources. Manhattan became a contested territory, which is simultaneously a sign of how bad things got and a sign that enough people survived to have something worth contesting. The most interesting development in Manhattan's story 15 years on is the methane discovery. Walkers, in their decomposition, produce methane, and someone in Manhattan figured out that 1 million decomposing walkers produce enough methane to be genuinely useful as an energy source. Refinery plants are being developed. The city that was the worst possible place to be at the start of the apocalypse has, through the slow alchemy of necessity and ingenuity, potentially become one of the most valuable places in the post-apocalyptic world. Manhattan is still at war with itself. The factions have not resolved, the politics have not settled. But there is electricity being developed there, which is something that most of the world can no longer say. It might come back, remarkably, improbably, in the ruins of its own worst nightmare. It might actually come back. Philadelphia is the most important city in the Walking Dead universe, and for most of the franchise's run, nobody watching knew it existed. That is not hyperbole. For years, the Civic Republic, the community built in and around Philadelphia after the outbreak, operated entirely in the background of the main story. A helicopter here, a brief mention there. Rick Grimes getting airlifted out of a bridge explosion and disappearing from the show after being taken away by the CRM. The audience knew something was out there. They did not know it was a fully functioning city of 250,000 survivors, with electricity and running water and schools, and a political system and a military organization that had been making decisions about the fate of the entire continent for over a decade. Not a camp, not a fortified settlement, a city, the largest surviving community in the whole Walking Dead universe. How it got there is interesting, and it goes back to a single decision made on September the 10th, 2010, one day after Los Angeles burned. The Pennsylvania National Guard, rather than following the orders that had been issued for Operation Cobalt, chose to fight back against the military that was implementing the bombing policy. They won, which meant that Philadelphia, along with Omaha and Portland, did not get napalmed. The National Guard then turned its attention to the actual problem, which was the outbreak itself, and their solution was elegant in a way that the other cities' responses were not. They found an island, specifically an island in the Delaware River that runs through Philadelphia. Natural water boundaries on all sides, defensible without requiring soldiers on every meter of perimeter, small enough to systematically clear of the dead. They cleared it. They built on it, and they grew. By the time The Ones Who Live shows us Philadelphia properly, it is extraordinary. Streets with lights, buildings maintained, or at least maintained enough to be functional. A governmental structure, still evolving, still complicated by the presence of a very powerful military organization, but something. The Civic Republic Military, the CREM, was ultimately led by a man named Major Jonathan Beale, and for a long time it was both Philadelphia's protector and its shadow government. The alliance with Omaha and Portland, 3 cities surviving and cooperating, trading supplies and information, maintaining diplomatic relationships across significant distances, is one of the more quietly optimistic developments in the whole Walking Dead universe. 3 American cities functioning. Not scraping by in basements, not fighting over food, actually functioning. That happened for a while. By 2018, 8 years into the apocalypse, Major Beale had reached a conclusion about Omaha and Portland. They were too dependent on Philadelphia. They were consuming resources without generating enough of their own. And in Beale's calculation, that dependency would eventually collapse the entire Civic Republic, dragging Philadelphia down with it. His solution was not to help those cities become more self-sufficient. His solution was to eliminate them. In August of 2020, the CRM deployed chlorine gas against Omaha. The entire population of a city that had survived everything the apocalypse threw at it was killed. Not by walkers, not by a natural disaster, but by the military organization that was supposed to be their ally. The campus colony that had been established within Omaha, people who had built lives there, children who had been born into the apocalypse and had never known anything else, all of them gone. The CRM kept this from Philadelphia's civilians. For years, the population of Philadelphia, hundreds of thousands of people going about their lives, working, eating, sleeping, raising families, did not know that their military had committed genocide against a city they had been in alliance with. By November 2022, the CRM had moved on to Portland. Rick Grimes and Michonne, having spent years inside the CRM structure in different capacities, infiltrated the organization and found the stored chlorine gas intended for Portland. They used it against the CRM leadership instead. Jonathan Beale and the extremist faction within the Civic Republic military were eliminated. The plan for Portland was derailed. The aftermath is complicated, but not without hope. The truth about Omaha was revealed to Philadelphia's population, which, I imagine, was not a comfortable moment for anyone. Democracy was introduced to the Civic Republic's governance structure. New alliances were formed with Alexandria and the Commonwealth. Portland, upon learning what had been done to Omaha and what had been planned for them, left the alliance entirely. Philadelphia is still there, still lit up, still with its schools and its political debates and its complicated history. They went through something monstrous and came out the other side with the possibility of something better, which is more than most of the cities in this video can say. Omaha's story is, in some ways, the most tragic in the entire Walking Dead universe. Not because of what the outbreak did to it, because of what another community did to it a decade after the outbreak, after Omaha had already survived the worst of what the apocalypse had to offer. The city survived Operation Cobalt. The Pennsylvania National Guard's refusal to follow bombing orders is what saved Omaha, just as it saved Philadelphia and Portland. Napalm was used. No Marines sent to shoot survivors. Omaha got to face the outbreak the regular, horrible way. Walkers in the streets, supplies running out. People figuring out in real time how to keep each other alive without the additional problem of their own military bombing them. They managed it. They cleared sections of the city. They established the campus colony, which had the kind of name that suggests schools and organised facilities and a community that was thinking about the future. not just the present. They joined the Civic Republic Alliance, trading with Philadelphia and Portland, receiving supplies and information in exchange for their own contributions to the network. By 2020, 10 years into the apocalypse, Omaha had been functioning for a decade, 10 years of people waking up in the morning and going through some version of a day, raising children in this world, building relationships, developing skills, maintaining the structures that make community life possible. All of that in a city that had survived the end of civilization. And then in August of 2020, the chlorine gas came. Not from outside, not from the dead, but from the military that was supposed to be their ally. What happened to Omaha in August 2020 was, by any definition, a war crime. It was also something worse than that, in emotional terms. It was a betrayal. The CRM did not attack an enemy. They attacked an ally. They used a chemical weapon against a population that trusted them, that had been in diplomatic relationship with them for years, that had absolutely no warning that the people they were allied with had decided they were expendable. The campus colony Omaha itself wiped out, not overwhelmed by walkers, not destroyed by a natural disaster, not even bombed by a panicking government in the first weeks of the outbreak. Killed by chlorine gas, deployed deliberately by the Civic Republic military in the 10th year of the apocalypse. And then it was covered up. Philadelphia's population did not know. The people living normalish lives in the Civic Republic had no idea that one of their treaty partners had just been murdered. For 2 more years, they went about their business in comfortable ignorance of what had been done in their name. The thing that I keep coming back to with Omaha is that we never really see it. The show tells us about it retrospectively, through the people who knew about it, through the horror on Rick and Pearl's faces when they piece together what happened. We get no scenes set in Omaha, no characters who call it home, no glimpse of what the campus colony actually looked like before it was gone. It exists in the story as an absence, a place-shaped hole. That absence is, I think, the most honest way to represent what happened to it. Omaha is not a dramatic spectacle. It is a statistic, a city that survived the apocalypse and then did not, and that the rest of the world barely registered losing. Portland came within months of being the second Omaha. The CRM's plan, by late 2022, was to eliminate Portland in the same way they had eliminated Omaha 2 years earlier. The same calculation, too dependent, too resource-intensive, a drag on Philadelphia's long-term survival. The same method, chemical weapons deployed against a population that had only just been warned about what was coming. Portland had survived everything, the outbreak, the early chaos, a decade of rebuilding, and was, by any external measure, a functioning community that had managed the apocalypse about as well as anyone could be expected to. What saved Portland was Rick and Michonne's interference with the CRM's plans, using the very chlorine gas stockpiled for Portland against the sea, our EM leadership instead. By the time the plan was derailed, the people of Portland had no idea how close they had come. When the truth came out about Omaha, about what had been planned for Portland, the city made a decision that I find quietly admirable. They left the alliance, after everything that had been invested in the Civic Republic partnership, after all the trade and the diplomacy and the years of building a functioning relationship with Philadelphia. Portland looked at what that relationship had actually involved and chose independence over association. It is not the dramatic choice. The dramatic choice would have been some form of retaliation, or a demand for reparations, or the kind of righteous confrontation that makes for a good final episode. Portland apparently just left, chose to go it alone, rather than remain within a structure that had done what it did to Omaha, which says something about what they valued that I think is worth noting. Portland's current status is independent and uncertain. They survived the initial outbreak. They survived a decade of post-apocalypse challenges. They survived the Civic Republic Alliance and the discovery of what that alliance had cost Omaha. Whether that independence holds, whether Portland can sustain itself without the Philadelphia supply network, is an open question the show has not yet answered. 3 cities form the alliance of the 3, Omaha, Portland, and the Civic Republic of Philadelphia. One was destroyed by it, one is still within it, changed and hopefully improved by the process of confronting what it had done, and one walked away. Portland walked away. What I find notable about Portland's story is that it is almost entirely told through absence and implication. We never actually see Portland on screen in any meaningful way. We know it survived. We know it was allied with Philadelphia and Omaha. We know it was hours from being killed. We know it chose to leave. And that is essentially all we know. A city of tens of thousands of people, with its own history and its own communities and its own decade of post-apocalypse experience, reduced to a series of facts that affect the plot without ever quite being a place. That is, in some ways, the honest shape of a world without telecommunications. The Walking Dead universe contracts around the people we follow. Portland exists and matters, but the story does not go there, and so Portland remains an outline, a city-shaped set of decisions out there somewhere on the West Coast, on its own. Somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, in the middle of everything falling apart, a submarine received orders. The orders were to launch a nuclear strike on Chicago. That sentence deserves a moment to settle. The United States military, the same military that deployed napalm under Operation Cobalt, that shot civilians in safe zones, that made a dozen other decisions that look unconscionable in retrospect, escalated to nuclear weapons. Not as a last resort in the most dramatic sense, but as a policy. Chicago was a threat in the military's estimation, and the solution was to remove Chicago from the map. Dead in the Water is the Fear the Walking Dead episode that tells this story, and it is one of the strangest, most contained episodes in the franchise. The entire thing takes place on a submarine. No wide shots of destroyed cities, no streets of walkers. Just a metal tube in the ocean and a crew dealing with an impossible situation. The crew got infected. The wildfire virus found them even in the middle of the Atlantic, which is a detail that says something uncomfortable about how thoroughly the outbreak had penetrated everything. And the survivors, the crew members who remained living, who had not yet turned, were the ones left holding the orders to nuke Chicago. They refused. It is a small moment in the context of everything. A handful of people on a submarine making a decision that the audience never quite sees the full consequences of, because Chicago does not subsequently become a major location in the franchise. But they made it. They were ordered to fire on their own country, on a city full of people who had done nothing to deserve what was coming to them, and they said no. Chicago's fate is left genuinely ambiguous by that refusal. The city was known to have been overwhelmed by the dead. The show tells us that through other references. But it was not napalmed under Operation Cobalt, and it was not nuked. It exists somewhere in between, fallen but not deliberately destroyed, overwhelmed but not erased. What that means for any communities that might have survived in Chicago is unclear. The city is never revisited on screen in a meaningful way. It is out there in the Walking Dead universe, somewhere in Illinois, in some state between ruin and possibility. A city that was almost nuked by its own government and was saved from that specific fate by a group of sailors in the middle of the ocean who decided to be decent. I don't know that the show intends that to feel hopeful, but it is a little bit. Quietly, accidentally, against all the institutional logic of everything else happening around it, Chicago got to keep its ruins rather than being turned into a crater. The thing about Dallas is that it did not just get the apocalypse. It got the apocalypse, and then it got a man named Teddy. Teddy is the main villain of the second half of Fear the Walking Dead's 6th season, and his particular brand of villainy is distinct from most of what the franchise does with its antagonists. He is not building an empire. He is not trying to control resources or dominate communities. He is a genuine, sincere doomsday cultist who believes that the apocalypse was the world healing itself, and that any survivors rebuilding anything are getting in the way of that healing. His goal is to accelerate the end, not survive it. Dwight and Al visit Dallas briefly in that season, enough to establish that the city is there, that it has the usual post-outbreak problems, that people are surviving in it in the usual difficult ways. It is a glimpse, not an exploration. The city itself is backdrop. And then Teddy launches his missiles. The warheads that hit Texas are nuclear. Not conventional explosives, not napalm, nuclear weapons, launched by a doomsday cult using weapons they should never have had access to. Season 7 of Fear the Walking Dead deals with the aftermath, a radioactive landscape across significant portions of Texas, irradiated walkers wandering through fallout zones, survivors having to navigate not just the dead, but the environmental consequences of nuclear detonation. Dallas, in that context, is hit with something considerably worse than what Atlanta or Los Angeles experienced. Those cities were burned. This city and the surrounding region was irradiated. The long-term implications of that, for any surviving communities, are bleak in a different way to the bleak implications of everything else in this universe. Walkers you can eventually clear. Radiation does not clear on a human timescale. Texas's story in Fear the Walking Dead eventually moves to a point where the worst of the fallout situation has been partially navigated, but it is always under that shadow. Dallas is out there somewhere in the radioactive Texas landscape, and what is left of it is not a comfortable thing to think about. Of all the fates in this video, I think Dallas's is the one I find most quietly awful, not because the scale is the largest, it's not compared to New York or Atlanta, but because of what caused it. Not a government panicking, not a military making calculated, awful decisions. Just one virus that escaped a lab and spread across the world, and had the means to help it along. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The most striking single image in the entire Daryl Dixon series, and there is real competition for that title, is a military helicopter crashing into the Eiffel Tower. The shot of the tower's upper section simply falling away, separating from the rest of the structure, and the tower standing there afterwards, as this slightly wrong, truncated version of itself. It is a good image. It does exactly what the best apocalypse imagery does, which is take something you recognize so completely that your brain processes it as fixed and permanent and show it broken. The Eiffel Tower has been in the background of so many things for so long that seeing it damaged feels almost physically uncomfortable, in a way that generic destroyed buildings do not. Paris at the time of the wildfire outbreak had a population of just over 2.2 million people. On the 27th of August, Monument Day, the same day hitting every city simultaneously, the French government issued a cell phone alert telling everyone to stay inside. That alert went out at roughly the same time that the same kind of alert was going out in every major city across the world, with roughly the same result everywhere. Not enough. Too late. People already too confused and frightened to follow instructions, even if the instructions had been clearer. By August 28th, one day after Monument Day, Paris was descending. Infected on the streets, riots, attacks. The military sent in helicopters equipped with machine guns, hence the eventual crash, in an attempt to contain things at an aerial level, which worked about as well as it sounds like it should have worked. Machine guns from the air against a city of 2 million people in the early chaotic hours of a global catastrophe are not a solution. They are a visible gesture toward a solution. We get this information through flashbacks from Isabel, a character in the Daryl Dixon series. Her memories of that first period in Paris are the lens through which the audience experiences the city's collapse, which gives the whole thing a personal, almost intimate quality. This is not a news report or a strategic assessment. It is someone's memory of watching the city she lived in become something unrecognizable in the space of about 48 hours. Many civilians fled to the countryside. This is a significant factor in Paris's story, and in France's generally. France is not Manhattan. There are roads out of Paris. There is countryside to flee to. The city's population dispersed in ways that urban populations trapped on islands or cut off by bombing simply could not. The power of the living is the faction that ends up controlling significant parts of the city in the aftermath, a nationalist military group led by a woman named Madame Junet. Not a heroic organisation, not a democratic one, but one that was effective enough at clearing walkers and establishing control that by the time Daryl arrives in the city, roughly 12 years after the outbreak, much of Paris is actually walker-free or close to it. The power of the living did something that a lot of other communities in the franchise failed to do. They actually pushed back against the dead, rather than just surviving around them. 12 years in, there are multiple communities still living in Paris. The Montmartre rooftop community is specifically mentioned as thought to still exist. The city operates without any central authority in the way Philadelphia has one, but it does not need central authority to have survivors. It has survivors anyway. Paris's arc in this franchise is one of the more unusual ones because it is a story of something actually getting better over time, rather than just stabilizing at a bad level. It fell badly in the first days, and then over the following decade it was slowly, partially reclaimed by survivors, by factions, by people who decided to push the dead back rather than simply coexist with them. The ruined top of the Eiffel Tower is still there, but there are people underneath it living something that resembles a life. Here is a fun detail, and I mean that sincerely. This is one of my favourite pieces of world building in the entire Daryl Dixon series. The reason a section of Barcelona survived the apocalypse 15 years in is because the Romans built very good walls 2,000 years ago. The Gothic Quarter. It is the oldest part of the city, the medieval heart of Barcelona, built around and in some cases on top of Roman fortifications constructed during Barcelona's first century as a Roman settlement. Those walls, stone thick, built to last because the Romans built everything to last, happen to create exactly the kind of enclosed, defensible perimeter that a post-apocalypse survivor community needs. The Gothic Quarter has natural choke points, limited entry routes, walls that were not designed for the 21st century, but that work extraordinarily well in a world that has in many respects reverted to something much older. Outside the Gothic Quarter, Barcelona in Daryl Dixon Season 3 is exactly what you would expect of a large European city that was not bombed but fell gradually to the outbreak. Streets crawling with the dead, infrastructure gone, buildings deteriorating without maintenance. The city that drew tourists from all over the world to its architecture and its beaches and its food culture is, 15 years in, a ruin occupied primarily by walkers. But the Gothic Quarter is still there, the Roman walls held, people are living inside them, which is either a wonderful example of ancient engineering outlasting its intended purpose by about 2 millennia, or a very good argument for building things properly the first time. Possibly both. Above the city, in the hillsides, a refugee camp also exists as of Daryl Dixon, Season 3's 6th episode, a separate community from the Gothic Quarter, higher up, presumably with better visibility and somewhat different challenges and resources. 2 communities in or around a city that, in most of its physical extent, no longer supports human life. There is something philosophically interesting in the Barcelona situation that I keep coming back to. The city did not get saved by modern technology or military organisation or government policy. It got saved in part by the accident of having a medieval neighbourhood with genuinely good fortification built into its geography. Whatever Roman engineer designed the walls of Barcino, the original Roman settlement, could not have imagined what those walls would eventually be used to defend against. But they work just as well against walkers as they ever would have worked against anything else. Spain broadly did not experience anything equivalent to Operation Cobalt. No government bombing campaign, no organised military escalation of the kind the US pursued. The collapse was more organic, more gradual, which in practice meant more chaotic in the short term, but left more physical infrastructure intact in the long term. The Gothic Quarter's survival is partly a product of that. It was never bombed, it just had to outlast the dead, and the walls made that possible. About 1,000 kilometres south of Barcelona, in Seville, someone with access to the Alcazar Palace had a similar instinct about old walls, but applied it in a rather more self-interested way. The Alcazar of Seville is one of the oldest royal palaces still in use in Europe. Parts of it date to the 10th century. It has been added to, modified, expanded across 1,000 years of different rulers and different architectural tastes, but at its core it is a medieval fortification with the defensive logic that medieval fortifications have. Thick walls, limited entry points, a structure designed around the assumption that people outside it might want to get in, and that this should be made difficult. The royal family in the Walking Dead version of Spain, a fictional royal family, worth noting, not a real-world commentary on anything, used the Alcazar as their base of operations both before and after the outbreak. Pre-outbreak, it was presumably their residence or ceremonial headquarters. Post-outbreak, it became their fortress, their seat of power in a country where power had become a much more immediate, visceral concept than it had been before. We do not see much of Seville itself. The show gives us the palace, the royal family's dynamics, and the broader sense of a faction using historical infrastructure as post-apocalypse leverage. What the city looks like outside the palace walls, whether it fell along similar lines to Barcelona, whether any communities exist in the city proper, is something we are left to extrapolate. Based on what we know about the Spanish situation generally, the city probably fell gradually rather than catastrophically, with pockets of survival possibly existing somewhere. The royal family that ran this operation is described as corrupt rather than benevolent. They were not protecting Spain for Spain's benefit. They were protecting their own position and using the stability they provided as justification for the authority they maintained. Which is, as political arrangements go, not particularly different from many pre-apocalypse political systems, just with the pretenses stripped away. Daryl Dixon burning significant portions of the palace down and killing many of its inhabitants marks the end of that particular power structure. Whatever political void that creates in the surrounding region is something the show leaves open. The palace is partly destroyed. The royal authority is gone. Seville, whatever it was under that regime, is now something else, undefined, uncertain, but not under the thumb of a corrupt monarchy anymore, which is at least a change in the right direction. England, initially, did almost everything right. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not what you would expect from the Walking Dead franchise, which generally treats competent government responses as a contradiction in terms. But England's early response to the wildfire outbreak, as described by Angus and Fiona in Season 2 of Daryl Dixon, was genuinely impressive. Island nation, natural advantage. The English Channel as a natural barrier. The Channel Tunnel as the single land connection to mainland Europe. And the British Army taking up a position there and guarding it. Locked down island, controlled borders, military deployment to protect the one vulnerability the geography had. London, with its 8 million people, running under martial law, but running. For a while, England looked like it might be one of the success stories of the global apocalypse. It was not. London, in its current state, as we see it when Daryl and Carol arrive 15 years after the outbreak, is a city of the dead. Not the quiet, emptied-out ruins of somewhere like Washington, D.C., but actively crawling with walkers. The streets of London are dangerous to walk due to walkers. The city that had housed 8 million people and was one of the most visited, most documented, most observed places on Earth is now a place where, according to Julian Chamberlain, there is no one left. Julian Chamberlain believes himself to be the last survivor in the entire city. He has not seen another person in years. Not decades, years. Which means at some point relatively recently by his reckoning, London still had other living people in it, and then they were gone, and he became the only one. I find that detail more unsettling than the general ruin of the city, a city losing its last inhabitants, not all at once, but person by person, until there is just one left. On Westminster Bridge, there is a makeshift perimeter, barriers, the kind of thing that someone built to try to defend a small section of the river crossing. It has been out of commission for a long time. There is no suggestion of it being actively maintained, but the physical evidence of the attempt is still there. Weathering in the Thames air. Someone tried to hold Westminster Bridge. They held it long enough to build something, and then they did not hold it anymore. My best reconstruction of what happened, piecing together what the show gives us. The military probably consolidated at some point around the Houses of Parliament and the government buildings on the south side of the Thames, set up that Westminster Bridge perimeter as their last defensive line and held it for a few years after the initial collapse. England had lasted longer than most places. London had lasted longer than most cities. But lasting longer is not the same as lasting indefinitely, and at some point the resources, or the personnel, or the will simply gave out. The English survivors who ended up in France, Angus and Fiona, left at some point and did not go back. The Channel Tunnel that the British Army guarded so effectively at the start of the outbreak eventually became passable in the other direction. And people who could leave couldn't. There is something specifically sad about London's story in a way that I am not sure I can fully articulate. It is not just that it fell. Many cities fell. It is that it fell despite doing so many things right. For so long, and that what is left of it is one man on a ruined bridge who has not spoken to another living person in years. The city that gave the world so much language and literature and history and institutions that got copied by half the world ends up as a city of 8 million walkers and one very lonely survivor. England tried. London tried. And the gap between trying hard and surviving is, in the Walking Dead universe, a very wide gap. From the International Space Station on Monument Day, Ludmilla had a view that nobody else had. She was a Russian astronaut, orbiting at roughly 400 kilometers above the Earth, conducting whatever she was there to conduct when the world below started changing. And at some point, we get this from her conversation with Victor Strand in Season 2 of Fear the Walking Dead. She watched Moscow go dark, the lights of one of the largest cities in Europe, just going out. On Monument Day, within 48 hours of Nick Clark finding Gloria in that Los Angeles building. Moscow at the time of the outbreak had a population of over 12 million people. It is one of the most densely populated cities in Europe, with extensive metro infrastructure and a climate that, while warm in late August, is defined by cold for much of the year. What happened there in the specific aftermath of Monument Day is not something the show gives us much detail on, but the detail that it does give us, the lights going out almost immediately, tells a story. Power infrastructure in a major city does not go out in hours because of a public health crisis. It goes out because the people maintaining it are not there anymore, or are not capable of maintaining it anymore. The fact that Moscow lost power on Monument Day and had not regained it 2 weeks later means that the civil infrastructure collapse happened as fast in Russia as anywhere else. The wildfire virus did not observe borders or political systems. It moved through a 12 million person city, the same way it moved through every other city, which is to say, devastatingly. What the Russian government's response looked like, we do not know. They had slightly different advantages than the American government, a history of managing large-scale emergencies, a large military, significant stockpiles of various resources, and slightly different disadvantages, not least of which was a government structure that was not always well suited to transparent, rapid public communication. Whether any of that made a meaningful difference in the outcome is something the show never gets around to. What Ludmilla could see from orbit watching Moscow go dark, is something the show mentions briefly and then leaves. But I find it one of the most quietly affecting details in the whole franchise. An astronaut, up there alone, watching her home city stop glowing, unable to do anything about it. 2. The vast mechanical indifference of the situation, the space station continuing in its orbit, the instruments continuing to record data. The world below becoming something that instruments could not really capture. We have no information about surviving communities in Moscow. We have no characters from Russia who tell us anything about what happened there after the lights went out. It is a city of 12 million that became dark on Monument Day, and that the franchise essentially does not revisit, which leaves Moscow as one of the truly unknown quantities in the Walking Dead universe, fallen, presumably catastrophically, and unaccounted for. If there is a city in the Walking Dead universe that probably had the worst time of anyone, Tokyo is a strong candidate for it. And that is saying something, given everything we have covered in this video. The detail comes from Teddy's prison news broadcasts in Season 6 of Fear the Walking Dead. The information he describes, and at that point in the outbreak he is in prison, watching news he presumably cannot verify. So there is a slight grain of salt element to this, is that Tokyo was hit by vast wildfires at the same time the dead started rising, 2 catastrophes simultaneously. In the world's third most populous metropolitan area, Greater Tokyo had over 37 million people in 2010. 37 million. The largest urban concentration in human history, and it was dealing with a zombie outbreak and a wildfire at the same time. The logistics of that situation are almost impossible to process. Emergency services overwhelmed by the fire, the dead, and the wounded simultaneously. Evacuation routes clogged by millions of people trying to get out, while millions more were already turning. Fire spreading through densely packed districts where the buildings are close together and where a failing fire service cannot respond. The density of Tokyo is a specific problem in a way that even Manhattan's density is not. Tokyo is not a city of skyscrapers spread over an island. It is a city that extends in all directions, dense and layered and interconnected in ways that create thousands of potential failure points in an emergency. The underground networks, metro lines, underground shopping areas, service tunnels would become nightmares. The residential neighbourhoods would become traps, and all of it on fire while the dead rose. Japan's gun laws are very strict, which is a detail worth mentioning because so much early survivor activity in American cities in the franchise involves people arming themselves fairly quickly. In Japan, that option is essentially not available to the general public. The adaptation required would be immediate and substantial. Whether any communities survived in Tokyo, we genuinely do not know. The show never returns there. The information from Teddy's broadcasts is the only window we get into Japan's situation, and it is not a window that suggests things went well. The combination of wildfire, population density, and the specific geography of Tokyo on islands, with extensive coastal infrastructure, surrounded by water in ways that might contain some aspects of the situation and complicate others, makes it the Walking Dead universe's most purely speculative major city. My honest guess, for what it is worth, if any communities survived in the Tokyo metropolitan area, they're doing so in ways that look very different from anything we see in America or Europe. The scale and the speed and the dual disaster would have required adaptations the franchise has never needed to depict. Japan has extensive, proven experience with large-scale disaster response. Whether any of that institutional knowledge survived and applied in this situation, that is the interesting question, and one the show has never answered. We have mentioned Operation Cobalt throughout this video, but it deserves its own section, because the scale of what it actually represents, when you step back and look at it as a policy, rather than as individual events, is genuinely staggering. Operation Cobalt was the United States military's containment plan that ultimately led to bombing its own major cities, not one or two cities in extremis, as a last resort in a specific desperate situation. 34 cities, as official policy, a systematic, planned, executed campaign of destroying the urban infrastructure of the most powerful country in the world because the calculus determined that destroyed cities were less dangerous than fallen ones. Atlanta got it, Los Angeles got it, Washington DC got it, but then there are 31 more cities on that list, mentioned in passing or implied, and most of them get no screen time at all. Phoenix, San Diego, Miami, Las Vegas, Austin, Salt Lake City, Seattle. Those are the names we know. There are likely more. Phoenix is worth thinking about for a moment. The 6th largest city in America in 2010, sitting in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, entirely dependent on complex water infrastructure that runs hundreds of kilometers to bring water in from rivers and reservoirs. A city of 1.5 million people that functioned, in normal times, entirely by virtue of technology and supply chains. Remove the technology and the supply chains, which the outbreak would do within days, and Phoenix becomes extremely inhospitable very quickly, even without a bombing campaign. San Diego has significant military presence, which would have made it both a higher priority target for those executing Operation Cobalt, and also potentially a place where organized resistance was more possible. Naval bases, marine bases, a military infrastructure that might have enabled a Philadelphia-style outcome. Whether the military in San Diego organized itself the way the Pennsylvania National Guard did, or followed orders like everywhere else, is not something the show tells us. Miami sits on the southeastern coast of a peninsula, with the Everglades to the west and the Atlantic to the east. Limited evacuation routes, high heat and humidity, a massive population. The peninsular geography would have slowed some aspects of the spread while complicating evacuation enormously. Las Vegas. I genuinely cannot think of a city that would have looked more surreal in the early hours of an apocalypse. The Strip. Those enormous, impossible buildings lit up with every colour simultaneously and then going dark. The casinos that never closed. The crowds that never thinned, gone. Las Vegas existing as a city only because of the entertainment infrastructure that made it feel like nothing real could happen there, and then something very real happening there. Seattle, up in the Pacific Northwest, rainy and temperate and relatively spread out compared to East Coast cities. Austin, a city in the process of major growth in 2010, its population swelling with tech workers and students and people drawn by a particular kind of optimism about what cities could be. 34 cities. The Pennsylvania National Guard stopped the bombing of one of them, Philadelphia, and in doing so, changed the entire future of American civilization in the Walking Dead universe. 3 cities survived because a group of soldiers decided the orders were wrong. 31 did not. The landscape of America, 15 years after the outbreak, in this universe, is a continent dotted with ruins. Not just the quietly empty towns and farms that the main show wanders through, actual ruins, places that were systematically destroyed from the air. An entire continent's urban infrastructure, gone. Whatever comes next, if anything comes next, is going to have to build it from something very close to nothing, in a landscape that was first fallen and then deliberately obliterated. That is the legacy of Operation Cobalt, not just that the cities are gone, but that they were unmade on purpose, by choice, by the people who were supposed to be protecting them. While the big cities were burning or being bombed or developing into carefully organized survivor civilizations, rural Georgia was doing something quieter and, in some ways, more characteristic of what most of the world was probably doing, just figuring it out. Woodbury is a small town somewhere in the Georgia countryside, and it matters to the Walking Dead universe because it is the governor's domain. Philip Blake, the governor, had found a community that worked in the narrowest possible definition of that word. Walls up, power running through generators, people housed, fed, relatively protected. The basic infrastructure of community survival assembled and maintained. The cost of that is the bits worth sitting with. The governor's community functioned because the governor was in complete control of it, and the governor maintained that control through a combination of selective information management and the specific, dark entertainment of the arena fights. Walkers in a pit watched by the community as spectacle, a pressure valve, an outlet, a way of making people feel something that was not fear by pointing the fear at something in a controlled environment. It is a genuinely uncomfortable system, and yet it lasted. Woodbury was operational for months before Rick's group encountered it, which means the governor had built something stable enough to run without constant crisis management. The people in Woodbury were not happy exactly, but they were not dead, and in the immediate aftermath of the apocalypse, that distinction carried more weight than it normally would. The governor's eventual attack on the prison, the community Rick's group had established as their own base, is what ended Woodbury as a functioning settlement. The community did not fall to walkers, did not get bombed, did not collapse from within. It got destabilized by the governor's own choices and dispersed into the Georgia countryside, some members eventually finding their way to other communities. The prison itself is a whole other story. Rick's group turns a functioning maximum security prison into something that is, for a while, genuinely impressive as a community. Cleared cell blocks, a garden, a council for decision-making, people planting things and learning things, and making plans that extend past the next week. The prison is the most ambitious community building project in the main series' first 4 seasons, and it is destroyed not by any structural failure of the community itself, but by the governor, again, showing up with a tank. The broader rural Georgia picture is one of genuine creativity and persistence. The survivors who came out of Tumanus, who found Herschel's farm, who built the hilltop in Virginia, they came from this region, this culture of rural communities figuring things out without institutional support. Small scale, personal, built on specific skills and specific relationships. No grand organizational theory. Just people deciding to help each other in the particular way that a farming community in the American South decided to help each other. There is something I find genuinely affecting about the rural Georgia communities in contrast to everything else we cover in this video. No one from the outside is going to help them. No military, no government, no civic republic, just the people who are there, and the land, and whatever tools they can maintain or adapt, and somehow persistently, that keeps producing places where people manage to live. Alexandria is the thing that The Walking Dead spent its middle seasons building toward without quite announcing it. A place where the survivors we had been following for years could stop running. A place with walls and electricity, and houses with actual beds in them. A place where Carl Grimes could go to school, in a sense, and where Rick Grimes could try, however uncomfortably, to be something other than a man in permanent emergency mode. It is a suburb of Washington, D.C., located in northern Virginia, close enough to the ruined capital that the skyline is visible on clear days. The distance matters. Alexandria is far enough from the urban centre that it was not a primary evacuation target, not a military priority, not a place that the government spent significant resources trying to either save or destroy. It was a suburb, a gated community actually, one of those developments with a homeowners association and a communal aesthetic, and the kind of infrastructure that seemed slightly excessive before the apocalypse and turned out to be exactly right after it. Deanna Monroe and her family were part of the original group that established Alexandria as a post-outbreak community. Deanna was a congresswoman before the outbreak, and her approach to building the settlement reflects that background. She was thinking about governance from the beginning, about what roles people should have, and what skills the community needed, rather than just about immediate survival. She asked people what they did before the world ended, and gave them jobs that built on those skills. a doctor as a doctor, a builder as a builder, a law enforcement officer as something resembling law enforcement. It is a sophisticated approach to community formation, and it worked. Alexandria was already years old and functionally stable by the time Rick's group arrived. It had walls maintained well enough to be genuinely protective. It had a power grid running. It had a process for making decisions that was not just one person dictating to everyone else. Rick's group arrived, and in the show's honest reckoning of this, they were a destabilizing presence as much as a strengthening one. People who had been operating in pure survival mode for years, who had forgotten or discarded many of the social skills and patience that community life requires, suddenly placed in a context where those things were expected of them. The tension between what Alexandria was and what Rick's group had become is one of the more interesting things the show does in its middle period. Over the course of multiple seasons, Alexandria gets tested. The knee gun conflict nearly breaks it. The Saviors occupying the community, extracting resources, reducing its members to subjects rather than citizens. The Whisperers do damage of a different kind, attacking the community's sense of its own permanence. But Alexandria survives both. Each crisis takes something, and the community is smaller and harder than it was, but it is still there. By the time Season 11 brings in the Commonwealth Alliance, Alexandria has become something with real longevity, real history. People who were children when they arrived are adults who have known no other home. The community has buried people and welcomed people and made decisions and made mistakes and is still fundamentally there. Alexandria, in the Walking Dead universe, is perhaps the clearest argument the show makes about what survival actually requires. Not massive resources, not military organisation, not institutional backing. A wall, people who know each other, decision-making that involves more than one person, and enough flexibility to absorb crisis without breaking apart. None of those things are glamorous. All of them turn out to be essential. The Commonwealth is the Walking Dead universe's most ambitious experiment in post-apocalypse civilization, and also its most revealing one. 50,000 survivors in a single community. To put that number in perspective again, most of the communities we have discussed in this video are operating in the dozens or the low hundreds. Alexandria, one of the great success stories of the franchise, manages its community in numbers that would fill a small village. Philadelphia is extraordinary precisely because nothing else we have seen comes anywhere close to its scale, and the Commonwealth sits somewhere between those two, large enough to have an economy, small enough to know it is vulnerable. We do not know exactly where in Ohio the Commonwealth is established, and we do not know the specific details of how it was founded. The show gives us glimpses rather than a complete picture. What we know is that it was established relatively early in the post-outbreak period, that it grew substantially, and that by the time the main series encounters it in Season 11, it is the most sophisticated community we have seen outside of Philadelphia. It has streets. Not streets in the way that ruined cities have streets. Recognizable corridors between structures that were once buildings. Actual maintained streets. It has restaurants, which requires not just food production, but food preparation at scale, which requires supply chains and staffing and equipment maintenance. It has entertainment. It has an economy with its own currency and its own rules about who has access to what. And there is the problem, because what the Commonwealth has done, with impressive diligence and considerable skill, is replicate the class structure of the pre-outbreak world. The people who had status and resources before the apocalypse retained them. The people who did not have status and resources before the apocalypse found themselves, in the Commonwealth, in roughly the position they had occupied before, serving, supporting, working the jobs that keep things running without having much say in how things are run. Pamela Milton is the governor of the Commonwealth, and she is the heir of a powerful political family. Her position is partly earned and partly inherited. which is a detail the show treats as a problem rather than as background colour. The Commonwealth is not a democracy. It is a managed hierarchy with democratic aesthetics, which is a recognisable enough political form to feel genuinely pointed as social commentary. What the Commonwealth represents, I think, is the argument that the apocalypse is not a reset. It does not clear the board and let humanity start again with better values and fairer systems. What it does, if you are not deliberate about building something different, is create the conditions for the same systems to reassemble themselves. Because the same people are building them, with the same instincts, and the same power dynamics, and the same tendencies. The challenge to Pamela Milton's governance, the events of Season 11's final episodes, the community choosing to reform its structures rather than simply maintaining them, is the show's response to that argument. It does not resolve neatly. Institutional change is slow and contested, and the Commonwealth is not suddenly a democracy just because the most authoritarian figure in its leadership was removed. But the attempt is made. The argument is had. The community looks at what it built and chooses, imperfectly and incompletely, to try to build something better. People making a collective, messy, genuinely human attempt to get it right. In Ohio, in the ruins of a world. No notes. About 70 miles from Alexandria, in the Virginia countryside, there is a working farm with a large house at the centre of it, surrounded by a wall, with people inside it growing food and raising animals, and trying to maintain some version of normal life, in a world that lost its right to use that word, on August 27th, 2010. The hilltop is one of the communities established in the main series' middle period, and it represents a particular model of post-apocalypse survival, one that looks, in almost every physical respect, like the kind of rural community that might have existed in the 19th century. Agriculture as the economic base, the manor house as the administrative centre, skills that would have been mundane before the outbreak, farming, smithing, basic medicine, animal husbandry, elevated to essential expertise. Gregory, who runs the hilltop when we first encounter it, is one of the show's more interesting minor figures, not because he's admirable, he's not particularly admirable, but because he represents a certain kind of small-scale political opportunism that is entirely recognisable. He inherited leadership of an already established community, maintains it primarily through managing relationships with more powerful external parties, and is exactly as useless in a crisis as you would expect someone like that to be. The Saviour's arrangements with the hilltop, demanding a portion of their resources in exchange for not destroying them, is something Gregory accepted and accommodated, because accommodating it kept him in his position. McGee Ree's eventual leadership of the hilltop is the more interesting story. Maggie comes to the community carrying an enormous amount of grief. Glenn's death at the hands of Negan is an event the show never quite moves past. Nor should it, and she turns that grief into governance. She is not soft about it. She is not conciliatory in the way that community leadership sometimes requires people to be. She is decisive and direct, and occasionally too willing to apply her own moral framework, as though it should obviously be everyone's moral framework. But she builds something. The hilltop gets burned by the Whisperers in a night attack that is one of the more devastating events in the show's later seasons, and then gets rebuilt. The rebuilding happens differently, in a different location from the original, with a different composition of people, but it is recognisably still the hilltop in the things that matter. The agricultural basis, the commitment to growing food rather than just finding it, the sense that this is a place people intend to stay. Maggie's son Herschel grows up there. The community buries its dead and plants for the next season and makes plans that extend past the next crisis. The hilltop in the Walking Dead universe is probably the most honest representation of what long-term rural survival actually looks like. Not dramatic, not particularly glamorous. Just the slow, unglamorous work of feeding people and keeping the walls up and dealing with the endless complication of human beings living in close proximity and disagreeing about things. The Kingdom is a community that the Walking Dead series introduces and then does not quite give enough screen time, which is a shame because what Ezekiel built there is genuinely one of the more unusual communities in the franchise. It is built around a secondary school in Virginia, which provides its physical infrastructure, a large campus, multiple buildings, enough interior space to house a substantial community, grounds that can be cultivated for food production. The school's practical layout makes it more defensible than you might initially think, and the community that has developed there is led by a man named Ezekiel, who has made the interesting decision to rule it as though he were a medieval king. Ezekiel's theatre background is the key to understanding the kingdom. He knows he is performing a role. He performs it anyway, and deliberately, because he has decided, and there is something quietly thoughtful about this decision, that people in desperate circumstances sometimes need a story to believe in as much as they need food and walls. He has a tiger named Shiva, which is perhaps the most extreme possible commitment to the bit, but it works. The community functions. The people have a narrative that makes the effort feel meaningful. Shiva is worth a paragraph on her own, actually. A tiger, alive in the Virginia countryside, years into the apocalypse, well fed and cared for, and functioning as both a genuine deterrent to threats and a living symbol of the king's authority. The logistics of keeping a tiger alive and healthy in a post-apocalyptic community are considerable, and the show does not fully explore them. But Shiva's presence is one of those details that make the Walking Dead universe feel more textured than it otherwise might. Someone made the choice to keep her alive. That choice required sustained commitment and resources, and it mattered in the end. Shiva dies protecting Ezekiel during the Savior's conflict, which is one of the more emotionally effective moments in a season that contains several. The Kingdom's participation in the war against Negan's saviors is costly. The community loses a substantial number of people. The ambush that kills many of the Kingdom's fighters in the conflict's middle section is genuinely devastating. The community that comes out the other side of the Savior War is smaller and harder, and in some ways less innocent than the one that entered it. Ezekiel himself carries that differently than most leaders do. There is a scene, I will not over-describe it because the emotional content is something you should encounter for yourself if you have not, where the performance finally comes apart, where the king stops being the king and becomes the man underneath, and the grief and the loss are right there without any theatrical mediation. It is one of the better character moments in the franchise's middle period. The Kingdom eventually merges with Alexandria and the Hilltop into a broader survivor network as the Virginia communities consolidate. Its distinct identity fades somewhat into that larger organization, but what it was at its height, a school full of people who had decided to believe in something larger than daily survival, led by a man who chose to give them a story, is worth noting as one of the more unusual and, I think, quietly wise approaches to community building in the whole Walking Dead universe. Terminus deserves to be in this video for reasons that go slightly beyond its role in the show, because it is the Walking Dead universe's most direct statement about what happens when survival becomes the only value. The settlement called Terminus was, before the events we see in the show, a genuine attempt at community, a sanctuary, as they called it then. The signs leading to it, those hand-painted signs promising sanctuary for all, those claims of community and friendship, were not originally lies. They were sincere. There were people at Terminus who genuinely believed in building a place where survivors could be safe, and then those people were victimized, severely, repeatedly, by other survivors who found them and took advantage of that openness. The experience of being hurt in that way by people you try to help, the show presents that as the moment Terminus turned into what Rick's group finds. Not slowly, not as a gradual moral decay, but as a deliberate choice. The people who survived what happened at Terminus decided, collectively, that the only rational response to a world that punished openness was to stop being open, to start being the predator rather than the prey. The practical expression of that decision is cannibalism, which sounds and is extreme. But the show frames it with enough care that you understand, if not excuse, the logic. If you have decided that other people are threats and you have access to protein, and you're not going to let the threat walk away, the arithmetic eventually becomes very dark. Terminus is what happens when the arithmetic wins. By the time Rick's group arrives, Terminus is a slaughterhouse in the technical sense of the word. Efficient, organised, operating with the kind of smooth logistics that speaks to practice. The people running it are not monsters in the way that cartoon villains are monsters. They are human beings who made a series of decisions, each following logically from the last, that led them somewhere irretrievably wrong. The destruction of Terminus by Rick's group from the inside, and by Carol's extraordinary one-woman siege from the outside, ends that particular community and disperses its members. Some of them die, some of them, including the leader Gareth, continue to pursue the same logic elsewhere before being stopped. And Gabriel Stokes, the priest whose church is nearby, and who had done his own version of letting people die out of fear, he survives and carries the weight of Terminus forward into the rest of the show in complicated ways. What Terminus represents in the geography of the Walking Dead universe is a dead end, literally and metaphorically, a place called a sanctuary that became its opposite, and the fact that it was, at the start, something real, an actual attempt at something good, makes it more interesting than a simple villain headquarters would be. The places that go wrong in the most instructive ways are usually the ones that started with good intentions. In terms of raw achievement, Negan's Sanctuary is one of the more impressive things in the Walking Dead universe. Not in terms of what it represents morally, that is considerably less impressive, but in terms of the practical scale of what was built and maintained. The Sanctuary is a large industrial facility, a factory essentially, converted into a community that houses several hundred saviours and a larger number of workers and families who live under the saviours' protection in exchange for their labour and their obedience. It has electricity, which the show presents as a significant achievement. It has manufacturing capability. It has agricultural production sufficient to feed a large population and still generates surplus for the system of tribute it operates across the surrounding region. Negan took this place over the course of several years before Rick's group encountered the Saviours. He built it through a combination of genuine organisational ability and a systematic application of fear as a management tool. The Saviours operate on a simple premise: follow the rules, generate the required outputs, and you will be protected and fed. Break the rules, and the consequences will be public and severe. It is not a pleasant system. It is an effective one, in the narrow sense that it keeps the machinery running. The Saviour's Tribute Network, the arrangement where communities like the Hilltop and the Kingdom give up half their resources in exchange for not being destroyed, is the Sanctuary's engine. It extracts wealth from a wide geographic area and concentrates it in one place, which allows the Sanctuary to maintain a level of resource abundance that most individual communities cannot match. This is a very old economic model, applied to a world where the normal mechanisms for challenging such arrangements do not exist. The Negan-era sanctuary is disrupted by the war with Rick's communities, and then by Negan's defeat and imprisonment, and then by the question of what to do with a large community built entirely around an authority structure that has just been removed. The Saviours without Negan are not a coherent organisation. They are a collection of people whose identities and loyalties were structured around one person's leadership, trying to figure out who they are without that structure. Some of them integrate into Alexandria and the surrounding communities. Some of them do not. Some of them, like Simon, were worse than Negan and were kept in check by Negan's specific version of the rules, and demonstrate immediately how how badly things can go when that check is removed. The sanctuary itself, the building, the infrastructure, remains useful regardless of what happens to the people who ran it. Physical infrastructure outlasts the communities that built it in the Walking Dead universe, and a functioning factory is a functioning factory. What it becomes after Negan is gone is something the show does not fully explore, but the physical capacity is there. That is more than most places have. New Babylon is a detail that Dead City introduces almost in passing, and then does not fully develop, which I find slightly frustrating because there is a lot of interesting world building implied by its existence. It is a capital city, the show tells us that much, through signage and dialogue. Capital city of the New Babylon Federation. Which means there is a federation, a political entity large enough to have a capital city and a functioning legal system with marshals to enforce it. Pearlie Armstrong, the marshal who pursues Maggie and Negan into Manhattan, describes New Babylon as something closer to a small town than a city in atmosphere. Tree-lined streets, families, people looking out for each other, the kind of place where he has a wife and 3 daughters and something resembling a normal life. The Federation is extending its reach enough to have marshals operating in New Jersey, hunting fugitives and maintaining something that functions like a justice system. That is significant. You do not have a functioning justice system, with officers, warrants, jurisdiction, without a reasonable amount of political and social stability underneath it. You certainly do not have marshals pursuing wanted criminals across state lines unless there is some agreed upon framework of law that makes the concept of jurisdiction meaningful. What New Babylon represents in the broader Walking Dead universe is the emergence of the next thing after survival. Survival is the first stage, keeping people alive, building walls, growing food, managing the immediate threat. The next stage is governance, rules, enforcement, something that makes predictable social behaviour possible across groups of people who do not all know each other personally. New Babylon appears to be genuinely in that second stage and doing it with some reasonable degree of success. The morality of the specific case the marshals are pursuing, whether Negan is actually guilty in a meaningful sense of the things he is wanted for, and whether the system pursuing him is just or merely functional, is something Dead City has interesting things to say about. But the existence of the system itself, whatever its flaws, is a kind of progress. Messy, incomplete, built on foundations that are probably not as solid as they look, but there. And that is, perhaps, what all of this amounts to. Progress. 15 years in. Not the world that existed before, and not the clean apocalypse fantasy where everything is destroyed and something purely good can be built from scratch. Just the world, slowly, imperfectly, in different ways in different places, trying to become livable again. Texas gets a longer and more complicated run in the Walking Dead universe than most states, largely because Fear the Walking Dead spends several seasons there after leaving the West Coast and Mexico behind. The Texas storylines introduce a particular flavour of post-apocalypse community that is worth spending some time on. There is the Dell Diamond Stadium community, a baseball stadium converted into a settlement with the field itself used for agriculture. It is one of the more creative uses of pre-existing infrastructure in the franchise, actually. A stadium is essentially a ready-made fortified community. High walls, limited entry points, enormous interior space, usually already with food service infrastructure that can be repurposed. The agricultural use of the field, which would have taken some doing given the artificial turf most modern stadiums use, is the kind of adaptation that speaks to people thinking seriously about long-term sustainability rather than just short-term shelter. Morgan Jones, who by this point in the story has been through the main Walking Dead series and the early Fear seasons and is carrying an enormous amount of history, ends up connected to the Texas communities. His presence there is part of the franchise's attempt to weave its different timelines together, to show that the people we have followed are part of a larger world that is all experiencing the same collapse in the same moment, just in different places. Virginia, played by Colby Minify, is the antagonist of the Texas period, a woman who has built her own network of settlements called the Pioneers, operating on a philosophy of control and order that is more explicitly ideological than most of the show's antagonists. She wants to build something genuinely. She is not purely predatory the way some of the franchise's villains are. She is, in her own estimation, solving the problem of how civilization survives, and the solution she has arrived at involves a great deal of coercion and not much consent. The Texas landscape in Fear the Walking Dead's later seasons, particularly after the nuclear events of Season 6, becomes one of the more genuinely hostile environments in the franchise. Radiation changes the walkers in that area, creates specific environmental hazards that regular post-apocalypse survival skills do not address. Communities in that part of Texas are dealing with problems that communities in Virginia or Pennsylvania simply do not have. Season 7's handling of the radioactive Texas landscape is honestly one of Fear the Walking Dead's more interesting creative periods. The visual of a genuinely transformed environment, walkers wearing hazmat suits fused to their decomposing forms, people having to reckon with the land itself as a threat rather than just the dead. It is a grimmer, less immediately survivable version of the apocalypse than most of the franchise depicts, and it makes the Texas community's ongoing existence feel genuinely hard-won in a way that is somewhat distinct from everywhere else we have covered. One of the things that the Fear the Walking Dead series does across its later seasons that the main show never quite manages is following a group of survivors across genuinely large distances through multiple different landscapes, encountering radically different kinds of communities and problems as the geography changes. The river communities that appear across the franchise's various storylines represent a model of survival that is quite distinct from the walled settlements we have mostly been discussing. Settlement on or near water gives you things that walls do not: a supply of fresh water, potential food through fishing, natural barriers on at least one side, and the possibility of transport and trade along the river itself, which, honestly, is just a very old piece of human knowledge being rediscovered. It is not an accident that human civilization built itself along rivers before it built itself anywhere else. People have known this for about 10,000 years. The apocalypse just reminded everyone why. The post-apocalypse communities that have figured this out are in many cases doing better than the ones that have not. Morgan's communities in Texas and the surrounding areas develop along these lines, using waterways as both resource and transport link. The network of settlements that develops across Morgan's time in Fear the Walking Dead is not as formally organised as the Commonwealth or as historically grounded as the Civic Republic, but it has a logic to it. Trade routes along rivers, communication between settlements, a sense that no individual community is entirely self-sufficient and that the connections between communities matter as much as the walls around them. There is a strand of thinking in the Walking Dead universe's later seasons, present in Dead City's New Babylon Federation, in the Commonwealth's network, in Morgan's Texas settlements, in the Civic Republic's three-city alliance, about what comes after the individual community. Every settlement, at some point, runs into the limits of what it can do alone. Food production only scales so far. Skills are only diverse if you have enough people to embody all the necessary skills. Security is only reliable if you're not perpetually one disaster away from losing too many people to sustain your population. The communities that survive longest in the Walking Dead universe are generally the ones that figured out, at some point, that their survival was not actually separable from the survival of the communities around them. The Civic Republic's alliance, even with the catastrophic failure of the CRM, worked for a decade because the underlying logic of mutual support was sound. The Commonwealth's network works because trading food for manufactured goods makes both ends of the trade better off. Alexandria's alliance with the hilltop and the kingdom survived multiple devastating events because three communities with different skills and resources are sturdier than any one of them alone. It is, in some ways, the oldest lesson in human history. You survive better together than apart. The apocalypse does not change that. It just makes it more immediately and viscerally obvious. Before the prison, before Woodbury, before any of the established communities that define the main series' middle and later periods, there is Herschel Green's farm. And the farm is interesting not because of anything dramatic that happens there, though dramatic things do happen eventually, but because of what it reveals about the earliest post-outbreak period and the choices that different kinds of people made in that first year. Herschel kept his infected family members in the barn. That decision, which becomes one of Season 2's central points of conflict, is not simply denial. It is a theological and ethical position, held by a man of genuine faith. Herschel Green is a veterinarian and a farmer, someone whose entire life has been structured around caring for living things, and he could not resolve the infected with the category of the dead. They were sick, they needed care, they might be cured. His farm, accordingly, was organised around a principle that Rick's group had largely abandoned by the time they arrived. The infected are people, or at least might be people, and should be treated accordingly until proven otherwise. The practical impossibility of that position becomes obvious fairly quickly. But the fact that it was the position Herschel held, and that he maintained it with genuine conviction, says something about the range of moral responses to the outbreak that existed in its early period before the consensus hardened. The farm itself is the closest thing to ordinary life in the show's early seasons. A working farm with crops and animals, a house with rooms and beds, morning light through windows, the kinds of small domestic details that the show mostly strips away as the seasons progress and the characters become more hardened and the settings become more extreme. Herschel's farm is the last quiet place in the first 2 seasons, and the show lingers in it longer than its narrative needs precisely because of what it represents. The last before. When the farm falls, the herd that materializes out of the dark, the desperate chaos of that night, it marks the definitive end of something. Not just for the characters, but for the show's emotional register. There are quieter moments later. There are moments of genuine domestic peace in Alexandria and elsewhere. But the specific quality of Herschel's farm, that particular texture of an ordinary place trying to maintain its ordinariness against the weight of everything that has happened, does not really come back. Herschel himself carries that quality forward through several more seasons as the moral centre of the prison community and the person most consistently committed to the idea that something of the old world, not just its physical structures, but its values, should be preserved. His death is one of the main series' most significant losses, and not only because of what it cost the characters. It cost the show a particular tone, a particular kind of voice, that was genuinely difficult to replace. At some point in any video like this, it is worth stepping back and trying to picture the whole thing at once. Not any individual city or community, but the shape of the world, or at least the Walking Dead universe's version of the world, 15 years after August 27th, 2010. In America, the map looks like this. A handful of surviving communities scattered across the eastern seaboard and Midwest, connected by trade routes and diplomatic relationships of varying formality and stability. Alexandria and its network of Virginia settlements. The Commonwealth in Ohio, its streets maintained, its restaurants open, its economy running. Philadelphia, still the largest surviving community on the continent. New Babylon, with its federation and its marshals and its tree-lined streets. Manhattan with its factions and its electricity experiments and its massive hoard being slowly converted into an energy source. Between those points, the ruins. 31 bombed cities plus Atlanta and Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. The radioactive stretch of Texas. The highways that Rick and his people walked down in those first seasons, now walked by no one, or almost no one. The small towns that never got a National Guard deployment and just became ghost towns. The west coast of America, California, the Pacific Northwest beyond Portland, is almost entirely absent from the story by the time the franchise reaches its current point. What's happened in San Francisco, in the broader California, beyond Los Angeles, in the Pacific Northwest beyond Portland, we do not know. The story moved east. The West Coast became, in narrative terms, a question mark. In Europe, the picture is patchier. Paris with its rooftop communities and its cleared streets, and its power of the living legacy. Barcelona's Gothic quarter with its Roman walls. The scattered communities across France that we catch glimpses of through the Daryl Dixon series. England, or what is left of it, with London an enormous ruin, and Julian Chamberlain somewhere inside it. Spain's communities in their fortified palace and their ancient neighbourhoods. What is happening in Germany, in Italy, in Scandinavia, in Eastern Europe? The show has not gone there yet. The rest of the world, Asia, Africa, South America, Australia, is essentially unknown. We have the Moscow data point and the Tokyo data point, and that is genuinely all we have for the vast majority of the human world. Whether something equivalent to the Commonwealth is operating somewhere in China, whether any Pacific Island nations turned their geographic isolation into genuine survival advantage, whether Australia's combination of isolation and, frankly, already extreme wildlife gave it any edge over elsewhere, these are questions the franchise may never answer. There is something slightly vertiginous about mapping out what we know and looking at how much of the world it does not cover. The Walking Dead is, ultimately, a story about a specific group of people moving through a specific region of the eastern United States and its connections. It tells us very clearly that the world ended. It tells us very incompletely what happened to most of it. And maybe that is honest. When the lights go out, the knowledge of what is happening on the other side of the world goes out with them. The survivors we follow do not know what happened in Tokyo or Moscow, and they do not have the luxury of finding out. They know what is around them, and immediately around them, and what their contacts can communicate. The world shrinks, and the story shrinks with it. There is a thread running through almost every city we have covered in this video that I want to pull on before we close out. Not the broad narrative of government response or military policy or community formation. Something smaller than that, the people who stayed. In King County, Georgia, Morgan Jones stayed for years, in a dead town with his son, and then without his son. After Dwayne was killed, Morgan was alone in King County for an extended period, and the show depicts what that does to a person with unflinching clarity. He lost his mind, in some meaningful sense. He wrote on the walls, he set traps, he stayed. In London, Julian Chamberlain stayed. He is still there when Daryl and Carol arrive, 15 years in, and he's been alone in the city for years. He chose that, or was unable to choose otherwise. The show does not specify, and the distinction probably does not matter much at that point. He is in London, in a city of 8 million dead, alone. In Atlanta, the Vatos gang stayed. A group of survivors who looked to Rick's group like a dangerous faction and turned out to be a collection of mostly older people protecting a nursing home full of residents who could not evacuate. They stayed in a bombed city to look after people who needed looking after. In Barcelona, the Gothic quarter community stayed. In Seville, the Alcazar's inhabitants stayed. In Paris, the Montmartre rooftop community stayed. In every place we have discussed that still has living people in it 15 years on, those people made a decision at some point, consciously or by default, to stay rather than leave. The Walking Dead franchise sometimes gets characterized as being about the journey, the road, the movement from one place to another as the characters chase safety, resources, hope. And that is true. There is a lot of moving, but the show is also quietly, deeply interested in the people who do not move. The people who looked at a fallen place and decided it was still theirs, who planted in the rubble and built walls in the ruins and said, this is where I am, and this is where I intend to remain. Some of them survived and some of them did not. The logic does not always reward staying. London's story suggests that staying can leave you alone in a city of the dead, which is not a good outcome. But the impulse itself, the refusal to abandon a place just because the place has become catastrophically dangerous, is one of the Walking Dead universe's most consistent and most human notes. Every city in this video that still has living people in it has them because someone decided not to go. One of the things I keep coming back to when thinking through every city in this video is the speed of it. Not the long-term arc, the 15 years of survival and collapse and rebuilding, but the first 48 hours. The window between Nick Clark finding Gloria in Los Angeles on August 25th and Monument Day on August 27th. 48 hours. That is the amount of time it took for the entire global architecture of human civilization to begin its terminal collapse. 2 days. It feels both impossibly fast and, when you think about it, entirely believable. Modern cities are extraordinarily complex systems that depend on thousands of people doing very specific jobs in very specific places at very specific times. Water treatment, power generation, food distribution, communications infrastructure, emergency services, financial systems. Every one of those systems has human beings at the critical points, and those human beings have families and fears and access to information, or, crucially, misinformation about what is happening around them. The moment those people start making personal decisions rather than professional ones, start leaving their posts, start going home to find their families, start protecting themselves instead of maintaining the systems they were there to maintain, the systems start failing. And systems failures cascade. Power goes out, which means water pumps stop working, which means pressure in pipes fails, which means fire hydrants stop working, which means fires that would normally be contained are not contained. Communications infrastructure depends on power, so when power fails, communications go with it. And without communications, coordination becomes impossible, which accelerates every other failure. The wildfire virus did not need to infect every person in a city to bring that city down. It needed to infect enough people in enough critical roles that the systems those people maintained became unreliable, and then the failures would do the rest. Moscow's lights going out on Monument Day, as Ludmilla watched from orbit, is a perfect image of this. Not every Muscovite was dead or infected on August 27th, but enough of the people who kept the lights on were, or were not at their posts for reasons of panic or grief, or the basic human instinct to be with family in a crisis. The 48-hour window also matters because of what it means for government response. The governments that did something useful in those 2 days, England's Channel Tunnel strategy, the Pennsylvania National Guard's decision to resist the bombing orders, did so before the full scale of what was happening was clear. They made those calls with incomplete information, in real time, based on judgment rather than data. The governments that waited for more information, that wanted to understand what they were dealing with before committing to a response, found that by the time they understood it, the window for effective action had closed. This is, I think, one of the genuinely honest things the Walking Dead universe says about catastrophe. The moment when action is most needed is almost always the moment when the information required to act confidently is least available. The communities and the governments and the individuals who survived best in the early period were the ones who could make good decisions fast, with bad information. Everything else followed from that. The world fell in 48 hours, and then 15 years of consequences followed. That asymmetry, 2 days of collapse, 15 years of aftermath, is really the whole shape of the Walking Dead universe. 2 days in, everything else out. We have been through a lot of cities in this video, a lot of places, a lot of fates, a lot of different versions of the same fundamental story. Something was there, and then the world changed, and what happened next depended on 1,000 factors that no one could have predicted or controlled. Los Angeles on fire, Atlanta bombed twice over, the quiet ruin of Washington, D.C., visible from Alexandria's walls. New York's skyscrapers alive with the dead, and also, somehow, with the living, and their zip lines, and their rooftop communities, and their electricity experiments. Philadelphia's 250,000 still with their lights on. Omaha, gone. Portland, still here. Paris, partly reclaimed. Barcelona's Roman walls holding, as they have held through rather a lot of history, London's last man on a bridge. What strikes me, honestly, when I look at the full picture, and I have spent rather a lot of time with this material, as you might have gathered, is how much variation there is. The Walking Dead is often described as being about the end of the world, and in a technical sense it is. The world that existed before August 27th, 2010 ended, that world is not coming back. But what comes after is not uniform ruin. It is enormously varied, shaped by geography and luck and policy and individual human decisions in ways that feel very true to how the real world works, even in extreme circumstances. Some places did everything right and fell anyway. Some places did everything wrong and produced communities that are still standing. Some places got bombed by their own governments. Some places got saved by ancient Roman architecture. Some places are being slowly reclaimed by people who refuse to leave them. And some are dark and will probably stay dark. And in almost every place, in the ruins of Atlanta, in the rubble of Terminus, in the Gothic Quarter and the Alcazar and the Westminster Bridge perimeter, long since abandoned, there are the marks of people trying. The walls they built, the plans they made, the things they planted and the structures they maintained and the decisions they recorded in some form, somewhere, about how they thought it should go. Some of those attempts failed, some of them succeeded in ways nobody expected, and some are still in progress, 15 years on, in a world that is still figuring out what it wants to become, which is, I think, the most honest thing the Walking Dead franchise has to say about civilization. It is never finished. It is always in the middle of becoming something. And the apocalypse, for all that it destroyed, did not change that. It just made the becoming more visible, more obviously at stake, more directly connected to the choices of the people doing the building. Anyway, that is every city we have managed to cover. There is plenty more I could get into. I have a whole video planned on the communities we only see briefly, and another one on the geography of the Whisperers' territory, and probably something on what the CDC actually found before everyone in it either fled or died. Those will come when they come. For now, I hope you are comfortable wherever you are. There are a lot of these places we have talked about tonight that I genuinely love thinking about. The Roman walls of Barcelona quietly outlasting everything the 21st century threw at them. The astronaut in orbit watching the lights go out. The people in Atlanta building something in the ruins of a city that was bombed twice. The fact that somewhere in London, if the show is to be believed, there is one man still holding on, still there, in a city of 8 million dead. Some of these places are fictional, but the things they are about, what people do when the systems fail, who stays and who goes, how communities form, and what they ask of their members, and what happens when they ask too much, those things are not fictional at all. The Walking Dead has always been using its dead to talk about the living, and I find that conversation genuinely worth having, even at this hour, even at this pace. Thanks for spending some time in this world with me. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.